Hey there! Recently, I started a challenge on Instagram to put together a Christmas party outfit using thrifted fabrics or clothing only. I found these silky curtain panels and got the idea to make a jumpsuit by hacking a sewing pattern I already owned to create the look I was going for. You don't have to use the same pattern I did. In fact, I wouldn't recommend this top because the raglan sleeves were a little harder to work with. Any basic top and pants pattern will do. That's assuming you're familiar with commercial patterns and know how to do a few workarounds. To keep the video short, I'll only be focusing on the changes I made. So let's get started. Starting with the bottom of the jumpsuit, I cut out the patterns for the pants, setting the waistband aside for later. After comparing my waist and hip measurement to the chart on the booklet, I went with the largest size, based on my hip measurement. Moving on to the layout, I folded one of the curtain panels in half, then laid out the pattern pieces. I felt much of the fabric was being wasted, so I undid the seams and gave it a nice press, then tried again. Much better. Next, I transferred all the markings before removing the patterns. In the front, I turned the darts into pleats by transferring only an inch of the dart legs using the dots as a guide. To sew the pleats, I matched the markings together, then sewed 1 inch from the waist down. After sewing the darts and pleats, I pressed them towards the center, then finished up the pants following the pattern instruction booklet. Going in, I knew the waist was a little big, so I fit the pants, then took in a couple inches using my hip curve to taper it into the original seam. All that was left to do on the pants was to serge the seams and finish the hem, which I left for last. For the top of the jumpsuit, I got out the patterns for the top minus the neck facing. I should add that this top was drafted for stretch knits only, so to play it safe, again I went with the largest size. Starting with the front and back patterns, I cut both of them on the lengthen or shorten line. Then I quickly cleaned up the edges before moving on to my layout. Using the leftover panel still folded in half, I laid out the patterns for the front, back, and sleeves. Before pinning and cutting, I shortened the sleeve length, leaving 2 inches at the underarm seam. Another thing I did was to tack on an extra inch at the center back since it was drafted to cut on the fold. I didn't think it was necessary for the front since I would be changing the neckline. Here's a close-up look at the pieces for the raglan sleeve. I used one of the size lines as a guide to shorten them. Jumping ahead here, I sewed the darts and sleeves on, leaving the side seams open. As you can see here on one side of the neck, I changed the shape by removing the point to give me the option of a plunging neckline. You'll see what I mean by that later. To make sure both sides of the neck were symmetrical, I pinned them together, then removed the excess. I know normally you'd do this step before putting the top together, but after I did, I felt the facing would be better to finish the plunging neckline as opposed to turning the edge under twice. So I placed and pinned the top on a large piece of paper, making sure the neckline was laying flat from the shoulder down. I then traced from the top of the shoulder seam allowance through the neckline, ending at the waist. I also traced along the width of the shoulder seam. For the width of the facing, I measured and marked 3 inches throughout. The back neck I drafted in a similar fashion by placing the center back along the edge of the paper after first measuring and marking 3 inches from the bottom. First, I quickly marked the pieces so I could tell which side was which. I had also iron fusible interfacing to the pieces, but found it to be too stiff, so I wound up removing it from the front neck later on. With the facings joined at the shoulder seam, I pinned and sewed it to the top with right sides together. Here's the neckline all done. I went ahead and understitched the edge of the facings. Now all I needed to do was to tack it to the shoulder seams. I also pinned the top to the pants to try it on and make sure everything was lined up correctly so I could clean up the side seams. Here's what it looks like after I cleaned it up. By the way, I overlapped the center front by about 1/4 inch at the waist. In the back, all I did was trim the allowance at the corner of the facing, flipped it over, and ironed the allowance along the center back. As for the closure, I hand sewed a hook and eye to the neck. Now, even though I was eager to finally sew the top and bottom together, I first needed to add the flounces to the sleeves. I started by measuring the width of the sleeve, then taking my measurements, I subtracted it by 1, then divided it by 6, which brought me to roughly 2 1/4. I discovered this method after looking for something easier than the slash and spread technique. Link in the description box below. Taking a large piece of paper, I folded it into 4 equal parts. From the corner, I used my measurement and measured and marked 2 1/4 to form a curve. I chose 4 inches for the length of my short flounce, adding another inch for allowance. So from the curve, I measured and marked 5 inches down to form an even larger one. I then cut along the curved lines, opened it up, and voila! To check if the width is accurate, you could go around it with your tape measure, but keep in mind your fabric will stretch a little or a lot depending on the fabric you're using. To make it easier for myself, I folded the pattern in half and cut out the flounces on the fold instead. I also cut open the circle to attach it to the sleeve. Okay, so as you can see here, I cut another flounce which is 4.5 inches longer by using the shorter one as a guide. I also finished the hems here. Not sure if you could tell, but I made the bottom flounce with the dull side of the fabric being on the right side to add a little contrast. To attach the flounces to the sleeve, I treated them as one by first layering the longer one on top of the shorter one with the wrong sides facing me. I would recommend basting them together beforehand. I then pinned them to the right side of the sleeve hem using lots of pins to keep the layers in place. After sewing on the flounces, I was left with a little extra. To remove it, I laid out and pinned the flounces as flat as possible to figure out where to cut. From there, I sewed the flounces together along with the side seams. After closing the sides, I was finally able to attach the pants to the top to complete my jumpsuit. Before sewing, I flipped over the center back allowance onto the zipper tape to conceal it. After sewing on the waist, I hand sewed a hook and eye above the zipper. And last but not least, I finished the hems. The waistband did come in handy after all for making the sash belt. I used it as a pattern, cutting it on the fold a couple times to create the length I wanted. And that was it, I promise. Oh, by the way, I placed a hook and eye at the bust, so I have the option to switch between a deep V or higher. Part 2 of the challenge is ongoing until December 22nd, and there'll be giveaways, so go check out the link below to participate. Let me know in the comments what you thought of this tutorial and if you'd like to see more pattern hack videos. Thanks for watching, until next time.